Canine German Shepherd puppy. Keeps following the forest ranger, begging for help, until she discovers the truth. A tiny canine German Shepherd puppy refuses to leave a forest ranger's side, desperately trying to get her attention. At first, she thinks he's just lost. But when she finally understands what he's trying to tell her, the shocking truth changes everything. Stay with us for a story that will touch your heart and leave you speechless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Ranger Emily Carter had always felt at home in the wilderness. The vast stretch of Blackwood National Park was her second home, a place where she had spent years protecting wildlife, rescuing lost hikers, and ensuring that nature remained untouched by human negligence. But in all her time patrolling these deep woods, she had never been followed by a puppy before. She first noticed the tiny canine German Shepherd puppy during her early morning rounds. The sun was barely up, golden rays breaking through the dense tree line, painting the ground in warm light. Emily was inspecting an old ranger station deep in the forest when she felt the strange sensation of being watched. When she turned, she saw him. A small black and tan German Shepherd pup, no older than a few months, stood several feet away, his ears still floppy, his body trembling slightly in the cold morning air. His dark eyes were locked onto her, filled with an intensity that startled her. He didn't bark, he didn't whimper, he just stood there. Emily frowned. A puppy, alone in the middle of the forest? That didn't make sense. There were no houses nearby, and stray dogs were incredibly rare in a protected national park. "Hey there, buddy," she called gently, crouching slightly to make herself less intimidating. The pup didn't move. Emily took a cautious step forward, but the moment she did, the little dog bolted. He turned and sprinted off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. She sighed. That wasn't a good sign. If he had an owner, he wouldn't be acting this skittish. But she had no way of knowing if he was truly alone. Shaking her head, she continued on her patrol. She'd keep an eye out for him, but she couldn't chase after a stray puppy all day. But an hour later, he came back. Emily was halfway through checking a nearby camping ground when she heard the soft rustle of leaves behind her. She turned, and there he was again. The same German Shepherd puppy, standing a few feet away, watching her with the same desperate look in his eyes. She stopped, heart pounding slightly. Why was he following her? This time, she didn't move toward him. Instead, she knelt down and extended her hand, offering him the chance to come closer on his own terms. "It's okay, little guy. I'm not going to hurt you." The puppy hesitated, ears twitching. He took a single step forward, then another. Emily held her breath, but just as he got close enough for her to see the dirt matted into his fur, he suddenly whined, turned, and ran again. Emily's frustration grew. Something wasn't right. He wasn't just lost. He was trying to tell her something. She stood, her instincts screaming at her not to ignore this. She had learned long ago to trust her gut, and right now, it was telling her that this was not just a lost puppy. This was something more. With a deep breath, she adjusted her gear, pulled out her flashlight, and followed the puppy into the woods. Emily pushed through the dense underbrush, following the tiny German Shepherd puppy as he darted through the trees. His small frame moved quickly, weaving between roots and fallen logs with surprising agility for his age. She had no idea where he was leading her, but something in her gut told her to keep going. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. The sun had fully risen now, casting streaks of golden light through the thick canopy. But Emily barely noticed. Her focus was on the small black and tan figure ahead of her, tail tucked, ears flicking back occasionally, as if to make sure she was still following. He wasn't running away. He was leading her. The realization sent a chill through her. If this pup had been abandoned, he wouldn't be acting like this. Most strays either hid from people or stuck around looking for food. But this one had a purpose. Emily picked up her pace, careful to stay quiet in case whatever she was about to find required caution. Then, suddenly, the puppy stopped. He stood at the edge of a small rocky clearing, panting hard, his tiny body shaking slightly. Emily stepped forward, scanning the area. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, just trees, thick bushes, and scattered rocks. But then, she heard it. A low, faint whimper. Her breath caught. It wasn't coming from the puppy in front of her. It was coming from somewhere ahead. Emily immediately reached for her radio, but stopped herself. She had no idea what she was walking into. Calling for backup before knowing the situation could put her in danger, especially if a wild animal was involved. Instead, she moved carefully, stepping over branches, listening closely. The puppy stayed right next to her now, no longer running, just watching. And then she saw it. Tucked between two large boulders was a second German Shepherd. But this one was much bigger. An adult dog. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped closer. The dog's coat was the same black and tan coloring as the puppy's, but it was covered in dirt, scratches, and dried blood. She inhaled sharply. The dog was injured, and from the way his ribs were faintly rising and falling, he was barely holding on. The puppy whined loudly and moved toward the larger dog, pressing his small body against him as if to comfort him. Emily's stomach twisted. This wasn't just another dog. This was his father. And the pup had been following her this entire time because he needed help. Emily immediately dropped to her knees, scanning the injured dog's body for signs of what had happened. His breathing was shallow, his fur tangled with dried blood near his hind leg. A bite mark, a large one. Emily's mind raced. A predator attack? A wolf? A cougar? Whatever it was, this dog had fought hard. She reached out carefully, speaking in a soft voice. "Hey, buddy. You're okay. I'm here now." The dog's eyes fluttered open just slightly, deep brown, filled with exhaustion and pain. But he didn't growl. He trusted her. Emily's heart clenched. This dog had dragged himself here trying to survive, while his tiny pup searched for help. And now, she had to get them both out before it was too late. Emily's training kicked in. She needed to act fast. The adult German Shepherd was severely injured, and without immediate care, he might not make it. The puppy had done his part. He had found help. Now, it was up to her to save them both. She took a deep breath, assessing the injured dog. The bite wound on his hind leg was deep, and there were scratches along his sides, possibly from a struggle with a wild animal. His breathing was labored, but he was still holding on. That meant there was time, but not much. The puppy whined softly, nuzzling his father's side. It was heartbreaking to watch, but Emily couldn't let emotions slow her down. She activated her radio. "Base, this is Ranger Carter. I have an injured canine, possibly an attack victim, near the West Ridge Trail. I need immediate assistance, medical transport if possible." The radio crackled before a voice responded. "Copy that, Carter. How bad?" Emily glanced at the dog. "Critical. Deep lacerations, possible infection. There's a pup with him, but he looks okay." "Understood. Closest unit is 20 minutes out." Emily cursed under her breath. The injured dog didn't have 20 minutes. She had to move him. Now. She took off her ranger jacket and carefully laid it over the dog, hoping to keep him warm. Then, she pulled a foldable emergency blanket from her pack and spread it out next to him. "This is gonna hurt, buddy," she murmured, kneeling beside him. "But I need you to trust me." The dog barely reacted. He was too weak. But his eyes stayed on her, as if he understood. She gently slid her hands beneath his body, trying to lift him onto the blanket. The moment she did, a sharp whimper escaped his throat. The puppy let out a distressed bark, jumping anxiously beside them. Emily's heart clenched. "I know, little one, I know, but I have to do this." Slowly, carefully, she lifted the dog inch by inch, ignoring the burning strain in her arms. He was heavy, his body limp with exhaustion, but she gritted her teeth and pulled him onto the emergency blanket. "Okay," she whispered, breathless. One step down. The puppy immediately curled up beside his father, refusing to leave his side. Emily grasped the edges of the blanket and began dragging the injured dog toward the ranger trail. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards to the clearing where backup would arrive. But every step felt like a battle. The forest was silent, except for the ragged breathing of the injured dog and the soft crunch of Emily's boots on the dirt. The puppy never left his father's side. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it. The ranger jeep approaching in the distance. Relief crashed over her. They had made it. She just hoped it wasn't too late. Emily's arms burned as she pulled the emergency blanket through the rugged forest path. Every step felt like a battle against time, against exhaustion, against the fear that she wouldn't make it in time. The injured German shepherd's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling unevenly. He barely reacted anymore, his body limp from blood loss and fatigue. The tiny puppy trotted beside them, his small whimpers breaking the silence of the woods. Emily refused to stop. She could hear the hum of the approaching ranger jeep, the low rumble of tires against gravel. The sight of it filled her with hope. But she knew this was only the beginning. Getting help was one thing. Saving the dog's life was another. As the vehicle pulled to a stop, Ranger Tom Dawson jumped out, medical bag in hand. "Carter, what the hell happened?" Emily barely paused, her breath coming in short gasps. "Possible attack. Looks like a bite wound. Maybe a coyote. Maybe something bigger." She motioned to the pup. "This little guy found me and led me to him." Tom crouched beside the injured dog, his face tightening. "Damn. He's lucky to be alive." Emily already knew that. Tom pulled out gauze and began applying pressure to the bleeding wound. The dog flinched but didn't resist. He was too weak to fight. "We need to move him now," Tom said, looking up. "The vet clinic in town is our best shot." Emily nodded. Together, they carefully lifted the dog into the back of the jeep, laying him across the padded seat. The puppy immediately jumped in after him, curling up beside his father without hesitation. Emily's throat tightened. "He's not leaving his side," she whispered. Tom shut the door. "Then we'd better not waste any time." Emily climbed into the passenger seat as Tom hit the gas, the jeep tearing down the trail toward the nearest veterinary hospital. She could only pray they weren't too late, and that this brave little puppy wouldn't lose the only family he had left. The jeep tore down the winding dirt road, kicking up dust as it sped toward Blackwood Veterinary Hospital. Emily kept stealing glances at the injured German shepherd in the back seat, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. Beside him, the tiny puppy refused to move, curled up against his father's side, as if his warmth alone could keep him alive. Every few seconds, the pup let out a soft whimper, his small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Emily's hands clenched into fists. She had seen animals injured before. She had even seen some that couldn't be saved. But this was different. This dog had fought to survive, dragging himself to safety, while his pup searched for help. He deserved to live. She turned to Ranger Tom, who was gripping the wheel tightly, eyes locked on the road. "How much longer?" she asked, her voice tense. 10 minutes, if we're lucky," Tom muttered. "Traffic in town might slow us down." Emily exhaled sharply. 10 minutes felt like forever. She turned in her seat, reaching back to gently touch the larger dog's head. "Hang in there, buddy. We're almost there." The dog's eyes fluttered open for a moment, just long enough for her to see the pain in them. Then, his body shuddered. The puppy let out a sharp bark, nuzzling against his father's face. But the older dog's breathing was getting weaker. Panic flared in Emily's chest. "Tom, he's fading." Tom swore under his breath. "We'll get him there, Carter. We have to." Emily refused to let fear take over. She did the only thing she could. She kept talking. "You're a fighter," she whispered, stroking the dog's fur. "You made it this far. Just hold on a little longer." The puppy let out another soft cry, his tiny body pressing against his father as if begging him to stay. Emily felt her throat tighten. Then, finally, the vet hospital came into view. The moment the Jeep screeched to a stop, Emily threw open the door and waved at the staff rushing outside. A vet technician, a young man named Daniel, ran toward them with a stretcher. "What happened?" he asked, as Emily and Tom carefully lifted the injured shepherd onto the stretcher. "Animal attack," Emily answered quickly. "He's lost a lot of blood, but he's been hanging on. The pup wouldn't leave his side." Daniel gave a sharp nod and gestured for them to follow. Inside the clinic, the air smelled of antiseptic and fur. The sterile white walls, a sharp contrast to the chaos Emily felt inside. A vet, Dr. Laura Phillips, was already waiting. She took one look at the shepherd and sprang into action. "We need fluids, oxygen, and prep for surgery," she barked at her team. Emily hovered near the door, the tiny pup still pressed against her leg. He had followed them inside without hesitation, his eyes locked on his father. A nurse knelt beside her. "We can check on the puppy too. Make sure he's okay." But the moment she reached for him, the pup growled softly and backed away, his small body trembling. Emily crouched down, offering her hand. "Hey, little guy. It's okay. You're safe now." The puppy hesitated, his big brown eyes full of fear and confusion. But after a moment, he pressed himself against her, hiding his face in her jacket. Emily's heart ached. "He won't leave his dad," she murmured. Dr. Phillips glanced up. "Then let's make sure his dad has a fighting chance." The surgery took 2 long hours. Emily and Tom sat in the waiting area, the puppy curled up on Emily's lap, asleep but still twitching every time a door opened. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her mind racing. What if the injured shepherd didn't make it? What would happen to the pup? Before she could spiral further, the doors swung open and Dr. Phillips stepped out, pulling off her gloves. Emily jumped to her feet. "How is he?" Dr. Phillips let out a slow breath. "It was close. He had deep puncture wounds, blood loss, and early signs of infection. But he's strong." Emily's heart soared. "He made it?" Dr. Phillips smiled slightly. "Yes. He's stable, but the next few days are critical. He'll need time to recover, but I think he has a real shot." Emily felt relief flood through her. The pup hadn't lost his father. She looked down at the sleeping puppy in her arms and whispered, "You did it, little guy. You saved him." The puppy stirred, stretching his tiny paws before nestling closer to her chest. Emily knew one thing for sure. Their story wasn't over yet. The following days were crucial. The injured German shepherd remained under close observation, his body still weak from the attack and blood loss. Emily visited the clinic every morning and every night, always bringing the tiny puppy with her. The pup refused to leave his father's side. Every time they stepped into the clinic, the puppy would pull on the leash, his little paws scrambling against the tile floor as he tried to reach the recovery room as fast as possible. The moment he saw his father, his tail would wag just a little, a flicker of hope in the midst of uncertainty. Emily sat beside them each time, watching as the tiny pup curled up against his father's bandaged body, letting out soft little whimpers as if telling him to keep fighting. And the father, despite his weakness, always lifted his head just slightly, pressing his nose against his pup, before falling back into exhausted sleep. Emily's heart ached every time she saw it. These weren't just 2 dogs, they were family. 1 week later, the miracle happened. Dr. Phillips greeted Emily with a wide smile as she arrived at the clinic with the puppy that morning. "Good news," the vet said. "He's ready to stand." Emily sucked in a breath. "Really?" Dr. Phillips nodded. "He's still weak, but we helped him up this morning." He took a few steps. Emily looked down at the tiny pup in her arms. "Hear that, little guy? Your dad's a fighter." The pup let out an excited bark, as if he understood. Inside the recovery room, the larger shepherd lifted his head as soon as they entered. His ears perked slightly, his tail twitching just enough to make Emily's throat tighten. He knew they were here. The puppy immediately jumped forward, pawing at the soft bedding before pressing his small body against his father's side. The adult shepherd let out a deep, low sigh, one of relief, of comfort. Then, to everyone's shock, he moved. Slowly, carefully, the injured shepherd pushed himself up, his bandaged leg shaking under his weight. Emily and Dr. Phillips watched in awe as he took his first wobbly step. The puppy barked excitedly, tail wagging so hard his entire body moved with it. And when the adult shepherd finally stood, his gaze locked on Emily. He took a slow step toward her, a choice, a moment of trust. Emily knelt, extending her hand. The shepherd pressed his nose against her palm, closing his eyes. A lump formed in Emily's throat. "Hey, buddy, you did it." Dr. Phillips exhaled, a look of admiration on her face. He shouldn't have survived that attack, but somehow, he did. Emily looked at the puppy, who was now circling his father excitedly, barking in joy. "No, somehow," she murmured. "He survived because of him." The pup had never given up on his father. He had searched the forest, risked everything to find help, and against all odds, he had saved his hero. 2 weeks later, the adult shepherd was finally discharged. Emily stood outside the clinic, watching as Dr. Phillips removed the last of his bandages. His fur had started to regrow where the stitches had been, and though he still had a limp, he was strong again. The puppy sat beside him, tail wagging, watching every move with admiration. "So," Dr. Phillips said, scratching the adult shepherd behind the ears. "Any idea what you're going to do with these two?" Emily hesitated. At first, she had assumed the shepherd had an owner, that he was a lost working dog or an abandoned canine, but after weeks of searching, no one had come forward. No microchip, no missing pet reports, nothing. Emily looked down at the two of them. The puppy's eyes were filled with pure devotion for his father. And the older shepherd, he never let Emily out of his sight anymore. It was as if they had both chosen her. She sighed, shaking her head with a small smile. "I guess that means they're coming home with me." Dr. Phillips grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Emily knelt, ruffling the puppy's ears. "You did all of this to save him. Now it's my turn to take care of you both." The puppy licked her face excitedly, while the older shepherd sat beside her, his eyes soft, trusting. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt peace. They weren't just two dogs. They were family. The drive home felt surreal. Emily had rescued countless animals before, but this was different. She glanced in the rearview mirror, where the two German shepherds sat in the back of her truck. The older shepherd, now healing, sat upright despite his limp, his eyes scanning the passing trees with calm alertness. The puppy, on the other hand, was curled up beside him, his tiny body nestled into his father's fur, content and safe. Emily's heart swelled. They had been through so much, an attack, fear, uncertainty, but now they were together. As they reached her small cabin near Blackwood National Park, she pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. She turned to them with a grin. "Well, boys, welcome home." The puppy barked excitedly, while the older shepherd simply watched her with those deep, knowing eyes. Emily led them inside, watching as they explored their new home. The puppy bounced around, sniffing every corner, his tail wagging furiously. The older shepherd, still reserved but attentive, walked slower, taking in his surroundings with careful steps. Emily kneeled beside him. "You're safe now," she whispered. The dog leaned into her touch, a silent acknowledgement of trust. That night, Emily sat on her porch, watching the stars above the pine trees. The two shepherds were curled up beside her, the puppy snuggled against his father, while the older dog kept his gaze on the horizon, as if guarding them. Emily felt something deep in her chest, a warmth she hadn't known she needed. She had saved them, but in a way, they had saved her too. As she ran her fingers through their fur, she whispered, "We're a team now." The puppy yawned, the older shepherd sighed deeply, and Emily smiled. They were finally home. The drive home felt surreal. Emily had rescued countless animals before, but this was different. She glanced in the rearview mirror where the two German shepherds sat in the back of her truck. The older shepherd, now healing, sat upright despite his limp, his eyes scanning the passing trees with calm alertness. The puppy, on the other hand, was curled up beside him, his tiny body nestled into his father's fur, content and safe. Emily's heart swelled. They had been through so much, an attack, fear, uncertainty, but now they were together. As they reached her small cabin near Blackwood National Park, she pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. She turned to them with a grin. "Well, boys, welcome home." The puppy barked excitedly, while the older shepherd simply watched her with those deep, knowing eyes. Emily led them inside, watching as they explored their new home. The puppy bounced around, sniffing every corner, his tail wagging furiously. The older shepherd, still reserved but attentive, walked slower, taking in his surroundings with careful steps. Emily kneeled beside him. "You're safe now," she whispered. The dog leaned into her touch, a silent acknowledgement of trust. That night, Emily sat on her porch, watching the stars above the pine trees. The two shepherds were curled up beside her, the puppy snuggled against his father, while the older dog kept his gaze on the horizon, as if guarding them. Emily felt something deep in her chest, a warmth she hadn't known she needed. She had saved them, but in a way, they had saved her too. As she ran her fingers through their fur, she whispered, "We're a team now." The puppy yawned, the older shepherd sighed deeply, and Emily smiled. They were finally home. The first night in their new home was peaceful. Emily had expected some restlessness, especially from the older German shepherd, who had spent weeks recovering in the clinic. But to her surprise, he settled quickly, curling up near the fireplace while his puppy nestled against him, just like always. Emily sat on the couch, sipping tea, watching them. It still felt surreal. Just days ago, she had been following a tiny pup through the woods, not knowing what she was about to uncover. Now, they were here, in her home, safe. But deep inside, she knew their journey wasn't over yet. The next morning, Emily woke up early to the sound of tiny paws scurrying across the wooden floor. She smiled to herself. The puppy was already awake. When she got up and walked into the living room, she found him sitting patiently by the front door, tail wagging, ears perking up the moment he saw her. Emily chuckled. "You're ready to go outside, huh?" The older shepherd was now awake too, slowly stretching his still healing body before making his way over. He was still limping slightly, but there was determination in his movements. Emily opened the door, and the puppy bolted into the yard, chasing after leaves, sniffing the ground, and tumbling over his own paws. The older dog followed at a slower pace, stepping into the sunlight for the first time since leaving the vet. Emily watched them with pure admiration. They had been through so much, especially the father. Yet here he was, still standing, still watching over his pup. She knew she needed to give them names. Turning to the older shepherd, she smiled. "I think I'll call you Shadow." The dog lifted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the name. Emily knelt beside the puppy, ruffling his ears. "And you, little guy, you're Scout." Scout let out a happy bark, tail wagging furiously at his new name. Shadow simply leaned into Emily's touch, pressing his forehead against her arm in a way that felt like pure trust. It was settled. They were hers now. Over the next few weeks, Emily worked to build a new life with Shadow and Scout. She wasn't just their caretaker, she was their family now. Shadow's strength slowly returned, and soon, he was keeping pace with Scout during their daily walks through the woods. His limp remained, but it didn't stop him from standing tall, his protective instincts as sharp as ever. Scout, on the other hand, was a bundle of energy, chasing after every butterfly, digging up everything he could, and constantly looking to Shadow for approval. Emily could see it, the way Scout adored his father. He mimicked his movements, learned from him, and never let him out of sight. And Shadow, despite his calm demeanor, always watched over him. Emily had never seen a bond like this before. One evening, Emily took them on a longer hike through the park. The sun was setting, casting golden light through the trees, making the entire forest glow. Scout ran ahead, chasing leaves, but Shadow stayed beside her, walking at her pace. Emily glanced at him. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Shadow's ears flicked, as if he understood. She sighed, looking out at the horizon. "I still wonder where you came from. If you were trained for, if you had a family." Shadow didn't answer, of course, but as they reached the clearing, he suddenly stopped. His ears perked, his muscles tensed. Emily followed his gaze. Ahead, Scout was playing near a fallen tree, completely unaware of the movement in the bushes nearby. Emily's heart jumped, then a low growl. Her stomach dropped as she spotted it. A coyote, crouching low, eyes locked on Scout. Emily took a step forward, ready to call him back, but Shadow was already moving. With one powerful bark, Shadow charged forward, positioning himself between Scout and the coyote. The coyote hesitated, ears flattening, taking a step back. But Shadow didn't budge. Even with his limp, even with his past injuries, he stood strong, his deep growl sending a clear message. "Stay away from my son." Scout finally realized the danger, backing away toward Emily. She reached for him, holding him close, but her eyes remained on Shadow. The coyote, after a long, tense moment, finally turned and disappeared into the woods. Emily exhaled, her pulse racing. Shadow stood there a moment longer, making sure the threat was gone, before turning and limping back toward them. Emily knelt, running her hands over his fur. "You just saved his life," she whispered. Shadow leaned into her touch. Scout, now realizing what had happened, licked his father's face, letting out a soft whimper. Emily blinked back the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. This wasn't just about rescue anymore. They had saved each other. And now, they would never be alone again. The next few days solidified what Emily already knew. Shadow and Scout belonged with her. Shadow, despite his past injuries, continued to regain his strength, and Scout never left his side, mimicking his every move. They explored the park together, learned from each other, and most of all, they healed together. One crisp morning, Emily opened the door to let them out, and instead of running ahead like usual, Scout stopped. He turned to Shadow, wagging his tail, then looked at Emily. Shadow stepped forward and pressed his head gently against her leg. Emily smiled, her heart swelling. "You're home," she whispered. Scout barked in agreement. Shadow simply stood by her side, strong and unwavering, and just like that they became a family forever.